Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Sunday Shot. Thank you very much for joining us again today. I will confess that today this is a pre-recorded episode because we were so horrified by all our technical glitches last week that we wanted to make sure this was an entirely seamless experience for both you and us. I am joined as ever by my co-host on the Sunday Shot, the editor of the Shot, Dave Milner.
Morning, Joe. Morning, everybody. And I want to just sleep in as well. I'm just going to own that now.
He's going to put that out there. But I think this might be something that we do a bit more frequently so that we don't have kind of horrifying glitches and freezes and all those sorts of things. We are delighted to have a stellar panel for you this Sunday. First up, we have the author of this quarter's quarterly essay, Woodside v. the Planet, Marian Wilkinson. Thank you very much for joining us, Marian. It's great to have you.
Great to be here.
And we are also joined by the last place on Earth's Jesse Noakes.
Hi, Joe. Hi, Dave. Hi, Marian. Great to see you all.
Look, it's great to have you all here on a week which really has been dominated by some of the fallout of the March for Australia, which we all know as the March for White Australia. Really kind of terrible sights to see, literally neo-Nazis marching through the streets of our cities. Jesse, you were there on the ground. How did you experience it over in WA?
I mean, it was definitely incredibly striking. It's like nothing I've really seen before. I think in Perth, I don't know how it was in other cities per se, but I mean, it was literally the case that a few dozen men in black, neo-Nazis, as you say, holding a huge banner reading Stop Immigration, led upwards of 10,000 people marching up the main street in Perth to WA Parliament. I don't think I've ever really experienced anything like that in my lifetime, at least in WA. And I mean, there were a large number of people gathered behind the Nazis, not all of whom I'm sure shared all of their views. Certainly I was hearing a lot about issues like the housing crisis as well, but nonetheless, if I were a member of the National Socialist Network, which I'm definitely not, waking up on Monday morning, I would have been pretty bloody excited with the fact that we had just experienced this extraordinary vindication, leading, as I say, a vast throng of people up to WA Parliament with no interference to speak of at all, and effectively facilitated by the authorities.
I mean, that was the same in Victoria, wasn't it, Dave? That actually it was the Nazis who were leading the rally as it went through the streets of Melbourne, and then the ultimate speaker, the climactic speaker, if you like, was the leader of the Nazis in Victoria.
It was. Thomas Sewell spoke from a podium that the Nazis brought, draped in an Australian flag, and spouted his racist, hate-filled ideology on the steps of Victorian Parliament with the protection of Victoria Police.
Which does seem extraordinary, the behaviour of the police in all of this. Now, we understand that free speech is something that needs to be protected, and where that line is drawn between free and hate speech can often be a bit of a movable feast and something of a grey area. But Go, Dave.
I do need to jump in here because I think there is a point that mainstream Australia misses about Nazism. And that is not equivalent to any other political ideology. It does not believe in participatory democracy. And it spreads like a virus. And so if you allow space for it in a democracy, it ends up swallowing it. That's why we treat it differently to other political ideologies.
And yet, on Sunday, it was not being treated differently to any other ideology. And indeed, we got a bit of both sidesism coming through from the authorities. There seemed to be, in some of the material that you posted, Jesse, that actually the authorities were more focused on some of the small groups of counter-protesters than they were on the black-clad Nazis.
Yeah, I witnessed that a couple of times towards the beginning of the rally when everyone was kind of gathered in the Supreme Court Gardens in Perth for the opening speeches. I noticed a couple of young women carrying Aboriginal flags approaching sort of the large crowd, immediately swooped on by a number of police, issued move on notices and escorted from the premises. I didn't experience or observe any police engaging with any of the actual protesters there for the march itself. And then subsequently on the march up to Parliament, as I say, I was sort of speaking with someone on the sidelines of that event. There was kind of a bit of a standoff between a smaller counter-protest and the rally going past with a line of police in between them, again, not making any attempts to intercede that I could observe until a small group of young men carrying flags with Arabic script on them turned up. And again, the police immediately, over a dozen police immediately swarmed them, ambushed them, in the words of one of those young blokes, gave them all move on notices and kind of quickly escorted them out of the Perth CBD. So I didn't observe any interference to the main march itself, but certainly a couple of very small groups of what you might call counter-protesters were very quickly pounced on and dispersed.
Similar theme, different results in Melbourne. Some of the Indigenous elders that I spoke to down at Camp Sovereignty said that they had footage of the police escorting the neo-Nazis from Camp Sovereignty the morning before the attack to the train station safely so they could go to the March for Australia.
We're going to go to some footage that Dave took from Camp Sovereignty on the ensuing days. Dave, any contextualising commentary you'd like to add before we go to that, or we'll save that?
Yeah. It does need some context, I suppose, because I went down there on Monday, not with the intention of filming anything. I was going down there because I've spent a bit of time there over the last year. What sort of happens is that often the Palestine rallies on Sundays march in that direction, and through serendipity of the universe, every now and then I've ended up there. And what happens all the time is that we're all made to feel very welcome. Uncle Robbie usually does some truth-telling, speaks about true history of what's happened here, and then they do a ceremony, a smoking ceremony, different to the stuff White Australia experiences at Welcome to Country. It's much more about a collective grieving, a collective processing, and a healing moment for everyone that's caught up in this atrocity. And, it is a beautiful thing. It's collective therapy that doesn't cost $280 an hour. And so this is not a space that White Australia needs to be afraid of. It is a very inclusive thing. And so I didn't go down there with the intention of filming anything. There was a press pack there, and I ended up just jumping in and making a nuisance of myself. And then I learned how to use iMovie last night. Jesus Christ. But the one point I do want to make, because I guess I've been studying resistance movements for decades now, and one thing that Indigenous leaders everywhere, whether it's Palestine, America, or Australia, one thing they all say that always gets omitted from the footage on the news later that night is that white supremacy and capitalism are the same thing. This is inherent to our economic exploitation. And this is the point they wanted stressed. Everyone that spoke said that over and over again, and I'm sure it was cut out of every single news package. I've left a little bit of it in there. But yeah, there's no narration. It's basically just, other than my questions, it's Indigenous elders and a Palestinian activist speaking about what happened.
Well, let's go to that now, but just to that point, I think that's very germane to some of the issues, Marian, that you raise in your quarterly essay later about the way that cultural heritage is treated by the behemoths of our capitalist society. So first up, we'll have Dave's package, and then we'll come out and have a bit more of a chat.
And I was here present yesterday when they attacked us. And I think I'm lucky to be here. If they had got hold of me, who knows? The Allies showed up for us yesterday, and that's why I have the strength to talk today. This was a coordinated attack. This wasn't an isolated incident at all. And we actually have been hassled out on our own country previously to this. Myself and my family have been targets for quite a few years when the same group, led by Thomas Sewell, done a similar terrorist act on our sacred country in Gowrie, the Grampians.
Robbie, what sort of response would you like to hear from the Prime Minister about this racially motivated terrorism?
Well, the hypocrisy that comes out of this country. Australia doesn't see the crimes in its own country. And we have genocide currently. Why don't they focus on those issues? That'll go a long way in resolving some of this issue. And if the Prime Minister to step up and say something about that, this is basically an act of terrorism that's happening in your own backyard. Very ugly. I'd be interested to hear what he says. Being reluctant to talk about other genocides, but Australia's a secret country, secret history. We've been involved in every war since the French Revolution. So we want to look at that. This has become a safe haven, it seems. So, fascist, racist, however you like it. Our people are basically the colonised refugees in their own land. Most jail people on earth, not just men, but women and children too. This is a subtle form of genocide that's continuing here. Make a statement about that. And he keeps saying that we're a sovereign country. Well, explain to me how you become a sovereign country. You haven't got a treaty. You haven't got consent to occupy our land. Explain to us exactly how you got sovereignty, when, where, and how. It's not my understanding of how law works. It's important for us as well. Yes. And we've got a right to occupy our land and express ourselves. Where's the opportunity to do that in our own country? It's not happening in the corporate bodies. They're misrepresenting our people. And the corporations are the ones who are responsible for the gap to a large degree. They're absorbing all of the resources that are meant to the people on the ground. It doesn't reach them. The government continues to press that idea. So, needs a fundamental shift in the whole way that they're dealing with Aboriginal people in this country and get real about it, We're not stupid. We've been around for a while, our people. We're quite capable of representing ourselves in a real way. We don't need corporate bodies, highly funded corporate bodies. See what that's about. I really do think Australia's afraid of the truth. And that's our weapon. Not only do we have the truth on our side, but the spirit of the land on our side as well. And sooner or later, you're going to have to deal with those things. Our people are about looking after this environment, the land. It's sacred to our people. It's our mother. We all understand that as Aboriginal people. And surely, we're talking about the long-term survival. It's unsustainable. Colonialism, capitalism, it's unsustainable systems.
And I have no doubt that there would have been good people who went along, heard about a rally, concerned,
I've seen them talk about long housing queues for rentals. They're concerned about their access to housing.
Of course. But you should have a look at who you're with on Sunday, I think, and the motivation that they have which isn't actually about housing or our economy or anything else. It's about sowing division. And neo-Nazis have, no role. The fact that people are openly
What did you think of what they did at Camp Sovereignty in Melbourne, where they went and destroyed that?
Well, it's just exactly. Here you have people who are saying they're against migration. Well, the first Australians were here before any migrant or descendant of migrants, and that just has no place. That sort of violence has no place.
Let me ask you about this. Yesterday, Julian Leeser told my colleague he stood by his statement that there was a direct line between your government's UN voting record and the attacks we've seen the arson attack on the Adass Israel synagogue. Now, ASIO says that Iran is responsible, but still Julian Leeser has stood by his comments. He says that you have delegitimised Jewish people through that voting record and actions. Are Jewish people delegitimised?
Well, I think they're unfortunate comments from Julian Leeser. I understand that this has been a difficult time for Jewish people, as well as it's been a difficult time for people with relatives in Gaza or the West Bank as well. We have been very clear and unequivocal about our opposition to the events of October 7. The contradiction in what Jill says is the best one.
Great.
Can you just tell us what you saw last night, Natalie?
Yeah, so last night there was a few of us here who were supporting Camp Sovereignty after the so-called March for Australia, and at about 5 p.m. we saw a group of men between the ages of 15 to about 30, quite young men, dressed in all black. They were marching down the street just around the corner, and then once they got to the bottom of the hill, they started to say some chanting and some sort of war cries, and then they ran up the hill towards us. They were holding flagpoles, they were holding metal poles, some bits and pieces of rocks and things like that they found along their way here. And then, the next thing we knew, a bunch of us were getting tackled and kicked and, punched and attacked in a very violent way.
I imagine that was terrifying in that moment.
It was scary, but I also had full trust that, the people who were with me were going to stand together and that we were going to hold the space for Camp Sovereignty. We did not want those neo-Nazis to come in and destroy the beautiful space that is Camp Sovereignty. I'm very, very proud that a lot of people stood up and that we defended this space. Of course, it was scary, but it's going to take more than a kick or two in the guts for us to back down.
Would you like to make a comment about how the mainstream press has reported these rallies and if they've done anything to quash or encourage this sort of sentiment?
I think that reporting the violence that was very much one-sided as clashes has been disappointing. The reporting of mainstream media on pretty much any protests in the last, few hundred years has been, quite disappointing, quite one-sided. It's very clear from the footage. We put our bodies on the line, us on the front line, taking footage of what was happening to showcase who is starting the violence and how is it being escalated. We saw where it was coming from, and the continuation of portraying this as a clash is abhorrent.
Just one detail.
Why is this fascist ideology continuing to spread? It is not about just these individuals. This is an ideology that's spreading, unfortunately, mainly in rural and regional areas, and in Victoria specifically.
Criminals need to be held to account. I witnessed several women being targeted and physically abused. One woman was grabbed by her forearm into the pack of neo-Nazis, and what's called a windmill, they slung her around into a chokehold, and then they dropped her on her head. And while she was partly unconscious, they laid the boots in and the fist. And And I was there screaming on the megaphone, "Get off her, get off her." I'm all about standing in our traditional love and our culture. We're peaceful warriors and we're inclusive, and everyone has a place of belonging in the story of this country and the future of what Australia could be without these neo-Nazis. Deport them, you know? We don't need them here. And the rest of Australia, you know, thank you for your support and getting behind us, because we know they're a smaller group and they don't have any power here. Camp Sovereignty represents true respect for the land and the old people who died fighting to defend our culture, our languages. We have direct linguicide as part of the genocide. They stole our mother tongues and our culture, and we're here reviving that with a truth-telling space, and it's meant to be a safe space for our mob. That's what we're here to speak for. We speak for the children of Gaza and the children of Congo, but we also stand strong in our law for our children, and they're the future of the oldest living culture in the world. And really, it should be a privilege to the state and federal governments that they get to yarn with us about how that goes into the future. And we want accountability. We want the institutions, the unis, the state and federal institutions to resource us. We want a keeping place here. We want to educate people, even though that's part of our cultural and colonial load that people don't understand. We're always educating the wider community in the world about who we are, where we come from, and what we really stand for. And we are, as I said, peaceful warriors. We're inclusive to everybody. Everyone has a place of belonging here.
Smoke for the dead. Only for the dead. There's an eternal flame supposed to be going. We're fighting for that, for the dead, and recognition of our suffering and their suffering. They were once human beings walking around here, and they ended up in a cabinet as an experiment, thrown in the military rubbish tip. All there where everyone sings songs of love and peace and harmony. Or the one night you have a Oz night there, and they all walk through here terrorising us, and they don't pull them up. Hey, don't turn them like an animal. That's what we got to put up with here. We're not just about black and white. We want to piss that game off. How do you get colour out of black and white? Only shades of grey, shifty buggers.
Rainbow one.
Rainbow, we're rainbow people. We're all one. We're all one. Why this stupid division? Because the world is festering with their colonies all festering, blowing up in front of their faces. 97% of the world colonised by Britain, Europe, and they wonder why there's immigration and famine and all this sort of issue. And the colonised coming to another colonised, acting like they're colonists as a fucking colonist football game. At the detriment of all us. Same. There's a bit of an uprising at the moment, black, white and brindle. Everyone's sick of it. This circle's about unity, it's for the dead, nobody owns it.
So, some very confronting imagery in that package. I don't think that the mainstream media had really reported on quite how extreme some of the violence got in Camp Sovereignty. And then when we did see it being referenced by Patricia Karvelis, I think we got about 20 seconds on that before we went in an odd non sequitur back to Julian Leeser and the way that he was describing the delegitimization of the Jewish people. Kind of odd, Marian, I thought, that we had Nazis going through the streets of our cities and that our anti-Semitism envoy didn't seem to have any comment to make on that this time round.
Yeah, and I think several people have made that point, Joe, because this neo-Nazi outbreak I think it's an incredibly serious moment for Australia. I did see some of the footage on NITV on the night, which really did shock me. And my immediate response to this is ASIO has talked in very general terms about monitoring neo-Nazi groups since basically the COVID lockdown protests. It seems to me, especially with someone like Thomas Sewell, very little has happened in terms of trying to actually crack down on these groups. And we know, if you look at the reverse, how it happens when you get hate speech from any of the Islamic preachers in Western Sydney. There's full front pages in the Australian and the Daily Telegraph. You know everything about what was said. You get Premier, Prime Minister level, opposition leader level responses looking for how to contain these people, how to ban them from publicly appearing, how to bring cases against them for hate speech. So my question is, where is that broad police ASIO political response to the growth of neo-Nazism? Because I think what we saw on the weekend was incredibly worrying. I noticed that there was a big uptick in the response once Sewell appeared at Jacinta Allen's press conference. And in one way, I think, well, that's great, but did it really take an intrusion into a Premier's press conference for people to take it seriously? Surely that footage at Camp Sovereignty was so shocking that immediately the responses should have come on Sunday night.
I'm going to jump in and say that Advance, the right-wing think tank, has pushed these marches. We know Gillian Segal's husband donated $50,000 to Advance. And I think what you see clearly is Zionism is a supremacist ideology, as is Nazism. And there are some alignments there that it confuses lots of people. But it was unequivocally the Palestinian protesters in the streets standing up to the Nazis. It wasn't the Australian Jewish Association, I'll say that much.
Yeah. Yeah, and Thomas Sewell has now been arrested, and I think arrested for the violence in Camp Sovereignty. But you're right, Marian, there did not seem to be much impetus behind the police investigation until that interruption of Jacinta Allen's press conference. And beyond that, we certainly haven't seen that high-level political condemnation of Nazis standing on the steps of our parliament houses. I want to perhaps take up some of the other issues that came out of Dave's package from Camp Sovereignty, which was this relationship between capitalism and really the crushing and desecration of First Nations cultural heritage and culture and language more generally. And that is something that you do take up in your this month's quarterly essay, Marian, around the Burrup rock art. And we'll get into some of the detail of that, but I know both you and Jessie have been following that for some time now. And I think the first point that I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about was there was all sorts of detail that was going on. Were these industrial kind of chemicals causing erosion of the art and all of that, and can it still be World Heritage listed with these sorts of chemicals in the atmosphere? But above and beyond all of that, is that there is this extraordinary site, which in terms of scale and beauty is almost unparalleled as historical artefacts. And yet a kilometre away from it, there are these huge industrial extraction sites that, separate from what is happening to individual petroglyphs, really seem to undercut any sense of preservation and celebration of this sort of great art and heritage that we have. Marian, can I ask you to sort of address that broader point first?
I think for any outsider visitor who goes there, who's not familiar with the place, that is one of the first things that strikes you. You go to, there's a place called the Deep Gorge Trail. There's some absolutely stunning rock art there. It's been preserved to try and introduce, if you like, the outsider to the rock art. But literally, when you drive up there and you go into that little area, if you walk to the end of the track and you sort of look around, you can see one part of Woodside's plant, the Pluto plant. The last time I was there, you could see the skyscrapers building the expansion to the plant. You literally turn around and you can see the giant Yarra chemical plant there, and you can physically hear the grinding of the bulldozers building the new Perdaman fertiliser plant that is going to be fed by Woodside Gas. And yes, I know some of the original industry there goes back to the 1980s and to the early 2000s, but it is kind of breathtaking that certainly after the first round of development in the 80s, people knew about the extraordinary heritage of that area, but that second wave of development happened when the Yarra fertiliser plant was built, later the Yarra explosives plant, and now we've got yet another wave when we really do know. There's no excuses for knowing how important this area is, and yet it goes on. So I think, yes, there's going to be a lot of scientific toing and froing about how much industrial pollution is impacting the rock art right now. But I think, to me, the stunning thing was that in this day and age, when we're really backing the World Heritage listing of this property, that you have before your eyes more development in that area when we absolutely did know better.
And Jessie, this site is kind of unprecedented in its scale. It obviously has incredible kind of sacred cultural value for the traditional owners. And yet, as part of this process that, as Marian describes, has been going on now for some decades, literally thousands and thousands of these petroglyphs have been turned to dust.
Yeah, and I think one of the most affecting interviews Marian did for this essay, which I think, as I've said in my review of it this week, I think is on the whole a really broad, engaging and a very deep investigation that brings to light this issue that has for far too long sort of sat in remote Western Australia and not been on, the national agenda in the way it really deserves to be. But one of the people Marian spoke to is a archaeologist who's been working up there since 1980, Dr. Ken Mulvaney. And I actually was lucky enough to spend some time with Ken last week myself, and both in Marian's essay and in person with me, the detail and the way that Ken describes the experience that he had working up there during the first construction of the North West Shelf plant in the early 80s, literally racing ahead of bulldozers to try and record and document these exceptional ancient sacred sites before bulldozers and dynamite literally ground them into dust that the North West Shelf now sits on. And Ken records how at least 5,000 individual rock art sites were either crushed or literally blown up to facilitate the construction of that plant. I think just speaks to the level of silence and forgetting that has attended this site and this process from the very beginning. I mean, it's fantastic and very overdue that the sort of national attention that Marian has given to this is now being paid, and obviously the North West Shelf Extension's sort of swung into political focus over the last few months in particular, and there's been quite a significant backlash, I think, to the federal government's proposed approval of another 50 years for this rock plant, for this gas plant. But the significance of what's happened over the past 50 years, I think, has not in any way fully been accounted for. And to me, when you hear people like Dr. Ken Mulvaney describing their anger, their hurt, and essentially the heartbreak, he described it as soul-destroying, that process, and the fact that it's still happening today, I think, is the real kicker for someone like Ken. He's been watching this happen for almost half a century, for almost his entire working life, and every single time, he told me last week, the government says this will be the last one, we're drawing a line in the sand, and then every single time industry has its way and the bulldozers come back. And I think for people who've been there as long as him, let alone the people who haven't been there 40 years, people who've been there 40, 50, 60,000 years, this process is just, truly soul-destroying. I mean, the soul and the stories of the traditional owners is in these rocks, and they're literally sitting under gas plants.
It's heartbreaking to hear, Jesse. I think it goes back to the point that the elders at Camp Sovereignty kept making, and again, all of them, that it doesn't really matter who the environment minister is or even who the government is, that actually if you want to stand alongside the people of this land, you do need to a degree, stand against neoliberal capitalism, because this is inherent in the systems that are being built, and this will keep happening no matter how much you like the environment minister, no matter how great their propaganda is, no matter how many times they fly the Aboriginal flag and celebrate the great Aboriginal football players. It is a bit performative unless we undercut the economic systems that perpetuate this forever, for hundreds of years.
I think you make that point very well in your essay, Marian, that, when Tanya Plibersek, who was the federal environment minister, was sort of inclined to do what she could, she was still basically howled down. And part of that does seem to be, and this is one of the central kind of premises of your essay, is the way that WA is run and the nexus of power that exists. And it really doesn't matter who is premier. We've had Labor premiers now for some time in WA. They fall into lockstep with the gas industry in particular, but extractive industries more generally, that what is good for Woodside and the gas industry is good for WA, and anything which threatens that and its expansion and the jobs that it's going to provide and the contributions it makes to the economy must be fought against.
Yeah, I think that it was so interesting. One of the things I did want to do was immerse myself in that culture. I grew up in Queensland, so I understand it quite a bit, actually, and I grew up in a very blue-collar home, so it wasn't that foreign to me. But I really wanted to understand that enormous gulf that exists between industry, both political parties' support for industry in WA, and the climate science and what the climate movement is trying to say about the climate science. And there is an enormous gap there. And just even on something like the Burrup Peninsula and the building of the fertiliser plant, which is going on about a kilometre's walk from Deep Gorge, several people, including Carmen Lawrence, the former Premier, said to me, look, I think it would have been possible, it would have been more costly, but certainly possible, just to move it onto the industrial estate a couple of kilometres down the road, away from the actual, entrance to the Burrup Peninsula. You could still have your fertiliser plant, even, despite its greenhouse emissions, but you could actually move it. You wouldn't have had to move the rock art. You wouldn't have had to disturb even more land there. But it would have cost more, both for extra port facilities and the actual pipelines for the gas. But even that concession could not be made. It was just that it was so much more efficient and easy to put it right there. And I think that's what a number of people like Carmen Lawrence, like Tom Hatton, the former head of the EPA, who've been in government. It's not that they're against development or they're against blue-collar jobs, but they're just saying, why is it so difficult to have a proper conversation where you can work out a much better solution for people than just giving it all one way without taking into account that there's other paths to go down here. And for me, I think one of the things that I found very interesting by the end of the essay was thinking the problem with what WA is doing, apart from, its issues about Indigenous heritage and its failure to take climate science seriously, it's also digging this massive hole for itself because, like it or not, even though it's going slowly, the energy transition is on. And really, if the WA politicians, backed by some of their federal counterparts and industry, keep going the way they are, they will actually find themselves like the car industry in South Australia and in Victoria, like so many industries on the East Coast. The world will, basically go by them. And I think that is the tragedy of all this. They claim that this is all being done for jobs and development, but in fact, they're missing what's going on in front of their eyes. That's my view. I think they're a decade out of date with what is actually happening with the energy transition.
Because Jessie, Marian noted in her essay that over the last sort of decade, WA was actually one of the very few, if not only, jurisdictions in the world, or certainly in the Western world, where emissions were actually increasing. Not even on a kind of net level, in real terms, up they were going. And so the great tension that exists between Woodside, with support of the government sort of doubling down on gas expansion, with all sorts of kind of arguments as to why this is actually good for climate change, is ignoring the reality that they're cooking the planet.
Yeah, and I think not only WA emissions continuing to rise and actually still increasing, I believe, but WA is also the only jurisdiction in Australia, at least, that doesn't have emissions reduction targets legislated for 2030, 2035, out to 2050 even. And legislation, as Marian details in the essay, that was due to be introduced last year, that was actually an election commitment at the 2021 election by the WA Labor government, has been shelved indefinitely to introduce those targets. Meantime, the discourse from the government has actually pivoted to such a degree that they are now claiming proudly that WA's emissions are needed to rise in order to literally, in the words of Premier Roger Cook, save the planet by decarbonising or assisting our Asian neighbours to decarbonise, in spite of the fact that the vast majority of the LNG that's shipped over to places like Japan is then actually on-sold for profit. And fortunately, of course, in terms of local accounting, the Scope 3 emissions from those from the LNG that's burnt overseas doesn't count towards our domestic Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and so it's very easy to write it off in, basically what amounts to an accounting trick. But the fact that the West Australian Premier will repeatedly, loudly and proudly proclaim that our emissions need to rise in order to bring down emissions as part of the global energy transition flies in the face of attempts by independent analysts, by his own MPs, as Marian points out. And a retired MP called Chris Tallentire went to Roger Cook and said, "This is great. Sounds amazing. Can you give us any evidence this is actually the case?" And the Premier said, yeah, no worries. We'll get the reports done. 2 years later, nothing's materialised. FOI attempts to get those released have been buried and suppressed due to cabinet confidence.
It's an absurd premise. Do we really even need evidence? Because the guy's saying we need to raise our emissions in order to lower our emissions. And, isn't that just inherently nonsense?
Well, it is.
Carbon doesn't go away. It stays in the atmosphere. It's,
Marian,
I think it was interesting to me because I'd looked at this when I wrote the Carbon Club quite a few years ago, and that was the rationale of the gas industry at the time of the Paris Agreement. We're going to displace coal gas is half the emissions of burning coal, so we are going to help the energy transition. And a decade later, this is still the argument. And this is why one of the pitches, I guess, I put into the essay is we do need a serious national debate on this, because this is now baked into our foreign policy, our trade policy, and our industrial policy. It's not that Roger Cook is just saying this to a WA audience. This is baked in to both state and national policy. And one of the things, again, why I keep saying that this is now, seems to me, so out of date, if you look at the speed of the transition that's happening now, on the one hand, with renewable energy, and also if you look at the new analysis that's being done on the emissions from gas, but in particular LNG, exported gas, the International Energy Agency is now saying, well, you might say that when you burn gas instead of coal, it's half the emissions. But if you actually look at the full life cycle of liquid natural gas, where you have to extract it, process it, freeze it, ship it, regasify it, then burn it, you're actually maybe looking at only 20-25% less emissions than coal. And as one of the IEA analysts put it, in this day and age of climate change, to compare yourself to the most carbon-intensive fuel on Earth and say that you're better than that is a low bar. You cannot do that anymore. And I keep saying to people, because the response of the gas industry is, well, if you eliminate gas now, you are condemning people to a future of, without heat, without light, etc., 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 and without industry. No one is saying that gas must disappear tomorrow. What they are saying is that there has to be a rational phase down of gas as well as coal. And because it's such a big export earner, not a tax earner necessarily, but an export earner for Australia, gas and coal, that has to be phased down, and we have to have that national discussion, because you know what? It's going to start disappearing anyway. So I think it's a big conversation, and I think the fact that it is so integrated in our national and state policies, it really needs to be picked apart.
Mm.
We quite clearly need to tax our natural resources to a degree that means we're going to use less of them, create less emissions, and then the money can come back into our community instead of a handful of oligarchs' pockets, which is essentially what the Indigenous people are saying.
Mm.
And I think just to cap that point, Dave and Marian, the one place the gas industry is certainly not keeping the lights on is here in Australia, or particularly in Western Australia. This 50-year extension to Woodside's Northwest Shelf extension, it's a gas export facility. Literally, the reason this gas is being turned into LNG, to liquefied natural gas, is to stick on ships and send overseas. And so little of that money, so little of that gas falls under the PRRT or other royalty schemes that there's almost a net loss to the Australian domestic energy market, because the demand for that overseas export gas is such that even onshore gas, which traditionally has been exempt from being exported overseas via, WA's domestic gas reservation policy, amongst other instruments, exemptions are now being applied to that for people like Kerry Stokes' onshore gas in the Perth Basin, that all of that gas is now being sucked out through the Northwest Shelf extension and shipped overseas to be on-sold to third-party markets. So there's just, at an environmental level, at a climate level, there's, no argument at all. But even at a basic economic or national interest level, it's very hard to see how any of these claims actually stack up in 2025.
Mm. And I guess there's sort of two things that are kind of sort of jaw-dropping and that cause the gas industry to have such a deleterious impact on our climate generally and the global climate trajectory. The first is, as you've already alluded to, Marian, and we might come back to that, is this Scope 3 emissions and the way that we just don't factor them in at all to our emissions budget. But The second thing, Jessie, I might ask you to comment on is the perennial lack of a climate trigger in the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, and all of the discussions that are going on around updating that, upgrading that, making that fit for purpose, which is part of what Tanya Plibersek was trying to negotiate with the Greens and Sarah Hanson-Young before the election. Any effort to do that, you might have thought climate is one of the key things which is going to impact our natural environment, but we just won't have a bar of it. And it wasn't even a climate trigger that looked like might get negotiated successfully by Tanya and Sarah. And there was Cook on the phone again, acting as the lobbyist for Woodside to the federal government. It just doesn't seem to be any way our politicians can deal with that.
No, they're certainly caught in a pretty big bind. I thought there were some really revealing comments by Murray Watt, the Federal Environment Minister, on another podcast earlier this week, commenting on his preliminary approval for Woodside's Northwest Shelf extension for another 50 years and making the case defensively that he was not required or even allowed to consider the climate impacts of that decision under the EPBC Act. And yet, in the same breath later in the interview, making it very, very clear that at this stage the government has no intention at all of introducing a climate trigger into law under the EPBC Act, and claiming that the Samuel Review explicitly ruled that out. Well, the Samuel Review ruled in and ruled out a number of things the government's got no intention of implementing either, such as a federal EPA that's a decision-making body rather than the minister. But the brute fact of it is that the West Australian government, via either kind of as a cause or an effect of a relentless campaign run by the gas industry through the Seven West media, particularly the West Australian newspaper, has spent the better part of the last 2 years lobbying relentlessly to ensure that there's no climate trigger or anything approaching that. Because I think one could very plausibly say the consequences for the West Australian gas industry would be significant were there to be considerations for the Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions impacts of some of these projects in our environmental laws. Murray Watt was at the UNESCO summit in Paris in July, proclaiming proudly that Australian environmental laws were some of the best in the world, in arguing for no additional protections on the Murujuga rock art as part of that World Heritage legislation. Well, he's claiming now that our environment laws are broken and need fixing, but the very mechanisms that would probably do the most to ensure that the most destructive projects were not permitted to proceed, seemingly not on the table at all. And I think WA has a large role to play in the politics that kind of lies behind that.
And that has been the inclusion of a climate trigger has been something, Marian, that the environment movement over in WA has been laser focused on. But as Jessie says, however strong their campaigns are, there doesn't seem to be any avenue for them to get that into any amended legislation. And they are going to have to look elsewhere, and there are perhaps other areas of hope in the ICJ.
Yeah, well, I don't know that I would argue that we shouldn't dismiss the idea of a climate trigger yet at this point. Certainly true that the WA resources industry, I include the gas industry and a lot of the minerals industry in there too, don't want a climate trigger in the laws. But I think a number of factors now, I don't know if it's going to change the debate, but I think it should change the debate. Number one is that, like it or not, it's now absolutely clear that the biggest long-term threat to the Australian environment is climate change, global climate change. And I think what we've seen this last year in the bleaching of Ningaloo, in the bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef, in that disastrous algal bloom of South Australia, just to mention the bleeding obvious, these are massive, massive environmental impacts. And we know that global greenhouse emissions contribute to that. The problem in our national environment laws as they stand at the moment is there is no way really to account for Australia's role in those global emissions and the impact that is happening on our environment. And I think it gets more and more intellectually difficult, if you like, not to mention legally difficult, to keep excluding greenhouse emissions from the environment laws for that very reason. But also importantly, just in July, of course, we had the decision of the International Court of Justice for the first time giving this advisory opinion, like it's not a binding ruling, but it is an advisory opinion that will affect litigation all over the world. And that said, basically, that countries and companies that are supported by countries that keep exporting fossil fuels can be held accountable under international law for the harm they create. And that's specifically looked at countries that license companies, that license their exports, and that subsidise with the support of infrastructure and other financial support, those exports. They can be held accountable. Now, we don't like to think about this, but Australia, along with Russia, along with the US, along with Saudi Arabia, we are one of the biggest fossil fuel exporters in the world. So that ruling applies to us. Now, I know the government's argument will be, yes, but we're reducing our emissions and the Paris Agreement will cover our customers' emissions, you know, the Japanese and the Koreans, etc. But this ruling says you've got a bigger obligation to that. You can't just rely on the international treaties. And I think once the implications of that decision by the International Court of Justice are fully understood, I think that is going to change the idea that Australia and the companies, the fossil fuel companies it supports, may face global litigation.
And that is essentially having to deal with the Scope 3 emissions that everybody keeps going, not here, not our problem.
Precisely.
And it is interesting too that it may well ultimately be in the courts where these issues really kind of reach their kind of ultimate kind of crisis, because I think we've seen with the re-election of Trump that we had entered a bit of a backsliding phase back onto drill baby drill and what was being called energy realism. But that may come to naught if, and I don't know about the American courts, but if now the ICJ is treated as a precedent, as guidance for courts, and we may see different outcomes from some of the decisions that we've seen recently, Jesse, in our courts, in the federal court thus far.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I'd just make one other point in relation to federal court as well. There was a decision last week, just jumping back to the Burrup itself, a decision last week in relation to an attempt by traditional owners 3.5 years ago to apply for permanent protections of the Burrup, which has been undecided since early 2022. And a federal court judge made a decision last week that delay was unreasonable and was an example of government neglect. He used that words 5 times in that judgment, and also made the point that while the report under that Section 10 of the Aboriginal Heritage, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Heritage Protection Act had been sitting on the minister's desk, that recommendations in that report had actually been rendered moot because the sites that they were designed to protect had been destroyed in the interim. And so you've got courts increasingly making very strong decisions that, while they might not immediately have implications, I think are sending a very strong message to the government that the failure to act is something that, you know, that will be noted and that account is taken of. And there are other examples where traditional owners have previously taken the government and taken Woodside to court over the Burrup Hub, for example, and won. And I think given the state of our current legislation, it's a narrow path to find mechanisms by which there are effective interventions that can be made. But given the state of our politics, the courts are effectively all that people have got at the moment.
Or finally, Marian, one other avenue of hope that you potentially posit is shareholders. Some of the big superannuation companies are major shareholders in some of these huge companies like Woodside, and that it actually may be some sort of shareholder activism which starts to think this is getting a little bit too hot in the kitchen.
Yeah, of course, I was fascinated to know that my superannuation fund had decided not to make a point of voting against Woodside's directors that were up for re-election this time around. Maybe not surprising, because my superannuation fund, Australian Super, has a lot of workers from the Australian Workers Union that are very supportive of the gas industry. But yeah, I think this is obviously a realistic outcome, that you will see shareholders beginning to move away. I do think that you mentioned before, Joe, the election of Trump and the new energy realism I talk about in the essay. I think that Trump's election has given a real breathing space to the oil and gas industry globally. And I think that will have an impact, especially America pulling out of Paris. You can see some of the big finance houses in America, some of the big hedge funds just stampeding away from their net zero commitments. However, I do think that's short term because, again, as I said before, elsewhere the energy transition is really moving quickly. And I think you only have to look at China for that. The unbelievable growth of China's solar business, but more importantly, its battery business, is really putting pressure on. A lot of people come back to me and say, yeah, but, China's still building coal plants. You won't see China weaning off fossil fuels. I don't agree. I think if you look at the car industry at the moment, no one predicted a decade ago that China would upend the global car industry, that it would take on the legacy players in Japan and Germany, but that is precisely what's happening now. And I think we're seeing this huge global shift with China exercising its foreign policy power, its trading power, and its military power, as we saw this week. You're also seeing it massively invest in places like Pakistan, Sierra Leone, Mexico, and other countries, massively invest in solar battery transformation there, accompanied by electric vehicle plants. And they're talking now about the so-called Sunbelt countries across the middle span of the planet, who will actually be advantaged by the energy transition. Countries like Pakistan, Morocco, Mexico, various African nations like Sierra Leone. That will change things because it's also it's happening in the global south. So that's why I think Australia, needs to be really careful. It just doesn't get left behind by clinging on to the coattails of America, Saudi Arabia, etc., and the big fossil fuel producers.
And always defending the likes of Woodside. We are out of time for our episode today. I do recommend, you go out and buy yourself a copy of this because it's a very elegant summation of what is happening in WA, but more broadly in the climate area at the moment. Before we go, as ever, we will ask our participants if they have any top tips that they would like to mention, anything that's caught your eye in the week that's gone or that you'd like to highlight in the week that's coming up. Jessie, anything from you?
It's not going to be a particularly upbeat one, I'm afraid. I'm going to take it back to the...
That's the vibe, dude. That's fine.
Yeah, well, it's kind of where I'm at this week, I think. Taking it back to where we started the show in relation to the scenes that we saw on Sunday with neo-Nazis leading tens of thousands of people on city streets across Australia. I just think this is going to get a whole lot worse before it gets any better. The photographs of Thomas Sewell being arrested by Victorian police on Tuesday, the grin on his face made him look like a man who's getting everything he's ever wanted at the moment. I think the response from the Prime Minister pointing to a Labor election landslide completely fails to grapple with the fact, or the point that Dave made earlier in the show, that neo-Nazism, that fascism does not operate to the tune of liberal democracy. The ballot box is not going to save you from thousands of people on the streets. And until this government can deliver serious, credible responses that actually make a material difference to the concerns of people who are marching behind those neo-Nazis, and that's things like the housing crisis, this is the logical endpoint of years of political stasis, and I think we need some really serious steps, and I hope the Prime Minister takes it a lot more seriously than his remarks this week about it not being particularly sizable crowds or large swathes of the population, because I think when you look at something that's been organised in 2 weeks largely on TikTok and you've got hundreds of thousands of people turning out, the government ought to be taking this very seriously indeed. I'm not seeing much sign of that.
We've just lost Marian, so no top tip from her, alas, unless she kind of comes back in imminently. Dave, what's caught your eye, or are you going to be focusing on?
No, well, I guess I'll just add a thing to this whole unfortunate, scary discussion. I agree entirely with everything Jesse said, and this is going to get worse before it gets better. And part of that is the way that it's being reported. That's why I asked that question in the besooted press pack. I would love Media Watch to explain to me why the Nazi rally has been framed as anti-mass immigration or even anti-immigration, in stark contrast to the way the Palestine rallies have not been framed as anti-genocide or anti-colonial. I would like Media Watch to explain why the difference is occurring.
Well, look, thank you all very much for joining us. As ever, if you like what we do subscribe to our channel, or get your kids to while they still can. Throw us a few dollars so we can keep doing what we do. And we very much express our gratitude to Jesse and the now absent Marian for joining us for this fantastic conversation today. And we hope to see you all again next week.
Thanks very much, folks, and go get a copy of Marian's essay. It's a good one.
Yeah, it is a good one.